Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to join this presentation today. I am Donga Mabasa, and I'll take you through our study, which was a community exposure assessment to antimicrobial resistance. And this is a case study of Malawi. So just a little bit of background, AMR remains one of the greatest global health threats. And currently, its transmission has been linked to poor water sanitation and hygiene. In low and middle income countries, such as Malawi, poor water sanitation and hygiene is a pre-existing challenge, which puts its population at a greater risk of exposure to AMR. However, transmission pathways of AMR within the wider community environment have not been fully explored, since efforts have previously focused on the healthcare sector. So our study therefore aimed at exploring potential human and animal exposure to AMR, and this was in the community environment. So to achieve this, we based our methods on the principles of the SANIBAT 2. This is a fecal exposure assessment tool, which we adapted and used in the AMR context. We carried out our study for 8 months. That's from September 2020 to April 2021. And it was conducted in 3 study sites. So these 3 study sites represented the urban, peri-urban, and rural community environments. In the first stage of the study, we conducted a preliminary assessment. In this, we had in-depth interviews with 9 community leaders. So this was done to understand the contributing practices to environmental contamination and exposure. And this was our first specific objective. And moving on from the interviews, we moved to the second stage of the study, which was where we conducted the transit works on the 3 study sites. So this was done to identify potential transmission pathways of AMR. Now, in the SANIBAT tool that we adapted, it already contains a list of potential transmission pathways. So these were identified in various countries, and this is during the previous studies that they had. So what was happening was that as we were going through the communities during the transit blocks, we were looking out for transmission pathways from the list that apply in our study sites. So for them to apply in our study sites, they also had to show evidence of risk to either people or animals for them to be included as a transmission pathway of interest. So once we identify the pathway, we collected samples from these transmission pathways, and these samples were captured in ESBL chlomagamidia. So this was done to identify our target bacteria, which were ESBL E. coli and ESBL Klebsiella. So these samples were collected from 40 sampling points from each study site. So we had a total of about 120 samples per month. So sample collection was repeated every month for the 8 months. This was just to capture if the differences in the seasonality also affect presence of these ESBLs in the communities. So moving on to the results. From the interviews, we learned that poor sanitation infrastructure often led to open drains that potentially become transmission pathways. In addition to the poor infrastructure, it was also reported that poor wash practices, particularly poor solid and animal waste disposal in all the 3 study sites also lead to contaminated environments that are potential transmission pathways. So both infrastructure and poor practices led to contaminated environments. So during the transit walks, we identified a number of transmission pathways and how people and animals are exposed to them. Most of the exposure was through contact and ingestion, as shown on the table on the lower left side of the poster. So from these pathways, the ones that have been listed in the poster, we grouped our transmission pathways into 4 categories. That's the drains, the standing water, the soil, and environmental swabs. So environmental swabs were collected from area of frequent communal contacts, such as borehole handles. So samples were collected in these categories and analyzed. So this figure 4 on the poster just shows pictures of the examples of the exposure pathways. So we have standing water in the open well, drains, and the borehole handles. And moving on to microbiological results, we had a total number of 960 samples. And from these, most of them were drains, making a total of 44%, followed by standing water, showing that drains and standing water were the major transmission pathways within these communities. So when tested for ESBL and Klebsiella, or ESBL E. coli and Klebsiella, over half of the drains, standing water, and soil were positive for ESBL. Compared to environmental swabs where they had more negatives. And in terms of locations as seen in figure 7, the urban they had the most ESBL presence with up to 68% of the transmission pathways being positive for either ESBL E. coli and Klebsiella. However, E. coli was the highest recorded bacteria, especially in the urban and also in the rural. So apart from the urban, the peri-urban was the second with the positivity. And lastly, it was the rural. The rural had a lower positivity rate compared to the urban and peri-urban. So as seen in figure 8, comparing the months in which we collected our samples, we can see that ESBLs were significantly present in the different months, which shows a persistence of these ESBL bacteria throughout both wet and dry seasons. Now, this just signifies that a continued and an ongoing risk within the broader environment that both people and animals are living in. Now, this brings us to our conclusion where we say that transmission pathways in the broader environment are posing a greater risk of AMR transmission. So it is important for communities to improve the environmental waste, sanitation, and hygiene conditions if we are to prevent the transmission of these resistance bacteria. I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining. And this study was carried out by Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine in collaboration with University of Strathclyde, the Washtenaw Center in Malawi, and the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Trust. Thank you once again.